Hello, everyone, and good morning and good afternoon to you. I am Antoon Masahad, the co-founder and the CEO of CDROs, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this exciting virtual roundtable where we will discuss anti-money laundering, AML, and ultimate beneficiary owners, UBO regulation requirements in the UAE and the GCC region. A quick reminder for everyone that CDROs 3 free trial compliance checks, namely CR Comply, will be offered towards the end of the webinar. A brief intro for everyone's benefit about CDROs, the event sponsor. CDROs has been at the forefront of providing world-class credit and compliance risk management solutions since 1997. Known for accuracy, reliability, and quality, CDROs can help you identify and verify full corporate hierarchy structure through our global coverage with expertise in the Middle East and Africa region. CDROs offers specialized UBO solutions utilizing our proprietary database of millions of shareholders and UBOs to facilitate UBO lookup and discovery across 230 jurisdictions worldwide. We also provide a 360-degree compliance risk management solution by linking the UBO discovery with compliance and screening checks to identify if third-party individuals or corporate entities are linked to sanctioned, criminal, and watch lists, if they are PEPs, PEPs, or if they face any adverse media. CDROs has best-in-class research capabilities, on-the-ground agents to identify shareholding structure, and UBOs when information is not digitally accessible. We enable digital real-time UBO lookup with subscription access to our CRIS intelligence platform. By the way, everyone, please note that where I am today, we have thunderstorms, and if you hear any rumbling, it's not my stomach, it's the weather outside. I did have my breakfast. To continue, CDROs offers a holistic solution designed to streamline and ease UBO discovery for potential regulatory risks. We have 3 options: UBO lookup, which is access to UBO information through our corporate structure. Based on historical data covering over 49 million companies, we automatically identify hierarchy relationships between subject companies, their shareholders, and UBOs. UBO Discovery Lite, where we conduct investigation on every shareholding entity across layers of ownership obtained from the ultimate official public sources. And also, finally, we do UBO Discovery Enhanced, where we conduct investigation on every shareholding entity across layers of ownership to identify or update information by physically inspecting and retrieving from the jurisdiction's commercial registry and retrieving the official corporate records of a company. So today, ladies and gentlemen, we'll be discussing 2 main points: AML, anti-money laundering, and UBO, ultimate beneficiary owner compliance in the UAE and GCC region. As you may all know, government authorities at international and national levels have been increasing the pressure on the fight against money laundering and terrorism financing. Identification and verification of the beneficial ownership of corporate third parties, including customers, suppliers, agents, consultants, and so on, are now an essential component of the Know Your Customer, KYC, onboarding and remediation processes. The UAE has been a regional forerunner in ensuring companies are compliant with AML and UBO regulations. The UAE Ministry of Economy and the Central Bank of the UAE have authorized licensing authorities across the country to begin implementing administrative penalties and fines against companies that fail to submit UBO information. There is now an increased pressure on the financial industry and other key sectors of the economy to adhere to regulations with regards to AML and UBO. So let's begin our discussion that will last about an hour. With us on the panel today are some of the region's leading experts. We have Mr. Mohammed Shafi, an AML Supervision Senior Specialist for UAE Ministry of Economy, Mr. Shatif Amaras Kara, Director for KPMG Lower Gulf, Ms. Alina Tatarenko, Legal Manager for JetX, Mr. Tomel De Silva Caesar, Group Head of Ethics and Compliance for Careem, an Uber company. Before we start, I will let each one introduce themselves briefly. So, Mohammed, over to you, please. You're on mute, Mohammed. Thank you.
My apologies. Hi, good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, everyone who is listening to this from across the world. Thank you, Anton, for the good introduction. And my name is Mohammed Shafi. I work for the Ministry of Economy in the UAE. We are entrusted with the AML supervision of the DNFPP sector in the UAE. Before joining Ministry of Economy, I was working with regional banks in the UAE in their compliance department, setting up AML CFT framework, customer due diligence, and all those stuff. So we would like to discuss today about the key regulations and other aspects with regard to the DNFP and specifically and across the UAE as well as in the region, and the challenges which we face while implementing at MOE as well as the entities in general. So I would like to welcome everyone. Feel free to ask questions at any point of time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mohammed. Alina, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. And first of all, Anton, thank you so much for inviting me and being a part of this great lineup of seasoned professionals. I pretty much look forward to this discussion, and I'm sure that I will benefit myself from the opinion of these experts. In a nutshell about me, I'm leading legal and compliance department of JetX. We are a global FBO operator, so we are in private aviation industry. I'm in this position since May of this year, and before that, I've been working as a legal and compliance manager in AMS, which is a US defense subcontractor. Basically, that's where I learned the rope of compliance profession and strict supervision of our American consultants abroad. And I will add to this discussion my opinion and expertise and my experience with regards to the beneficial owners requirements and the implementation of the new regulations in the UAE. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alina. Thank you for being with us today. We will pass over to Sashit. Sashit, please, if you don't mind.
No problem at all. Anton, pleasure to be again on a panel with you. I think it's a couple of months. So thank you for inviting me, and a pleasure to sort of be here with you. So I'm a director at KPMG. My name is Sachit Amarasekar. Good go, Anton, at trying to pronounce that. But call me Sach going forward. It's a lot easier, I think. So I'm a director. I look after the financial crime advisory pillar within KPMG for the Lower Gulf, which is the UAE and Oman. For us, I've been with sort of KPMG for the past 4 years or so, really sort of working with banks, central bank, some of the other federal entities, even the Ministry of Economy, in various aspects related to AML and the beneficial ownership changes as well. So I've got a background where I was coming from Standard Chartered Bank and another big four across UK, Hong Kong, and Singapore. So I'll bring us some of that experience into this as well, where we're seeing where the world's going. And I wouldn't say UAE is catching up. I think UAE is sort of already up there, but the changing landscape within UAE, which is changing maybe a lot faster than some of these other jurisdictions are used to. So we're finding a lot of new players and new stakeholders who are coming in, who suddenly sort of have these obligations that's coming in that's new for them, because actually it's been around in the world for a long time. So I'll try and bring that perspective on this conversation as we go through.
It's great. Thank you, Sashit. And thank you very much for being with us today as well and bringing your wealth of knowledge with you. And last but not least, I'll pass over to Tomel, please.
Hi, thanks, Antoon, and to Cedar Rose for this great opportunity to speak with you all and the esteemed panelists. It's a pleasure to join you in talking about today's discussion. My name is Tamel De Silva Caesar. I'm the current group head of ethics and compliance for Careem, which is a fully owned subsidiary of the Uber Group. I've been in the ethics, compliance, and governance space for 15 years. I'm currently based in Dubai in the United Arab Emirates, but I previously held numerous leadership positions in a multitude of multinational companies. I've had the pleasure with working with French multinationals, German multinationals, even a brief stint in a national Emirati state-owned enterprise, and of course now with the Americans. So my perspective is more internationalized, and that's what I hope to bring forth to the discussion today. Is that not only is the UAE and the GCC sort of taking these actions to strengthen anti-corruption and AML and CTF controls, but any international enterprise which is operating in this region has had these obligations, for quite some time. And so, from the perspective of the FCPA, or purely from an ethical point of view, standard corporate compliance departments are really tasked with going to that nth degree in order to ensure that their programs are operating not only from an ethical standpoint, but from a regulatory standpoint in line with expectations. So thanks again for this lovely opportunity.
Great, and well said as well. I totally agree with you on both extension of the regulatory as well as the ethical commitments and meeting certain obligations as well. And no doubt also you bring with you, Tomel, a great experience from the private and the government sector, from your wealth of expertise at different posts that you've had, including at the government level in the US. So, ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, we have a panel that bring with them a huge amount of expertise, not only from the UAE and the GCC region, but from international level and from various industries and background as well to them. So thank you for being with us, to our guest speakers. To all the guests who joined us today on this webinar, please note that additional questions can be raised and discussed during the event. For our speakers, please feel also free to contribute with your valid points and based on your experiences when you feel you can at any point. So without further ado, let's start the program with some introduction type of questions addressing our today's subjects. The first question will be, why have anti-money laundering AML topics become so important in the UAE and GCC region? And I would like to ask that question first to Tomel, and then also afterwards to Mohammed, if I may, please. So Tomel, over to you.
So it's a pleasure to have Mohammed here. So I will not speak extensively about the UAE's regulatory approach and sort of the rationale behind that. But one interesting fact I wanted to touch base on, and I'm sure Mohammed, you're intimately familiar with this, is the recent FATF Financial Action Task Force report that was issued in April 2020 regarding the UAE. And FATF is, as you all may know, is an independent intergovernmental body that specializes in advising at a country level what types of anti-money laundering and counterterrorism financing initiatives can be implemented in order to strengthen those kinds of controls, sort of from a more regulatory standpoint. And as a layman's reading that report, it's quite extensive. If you haven't had the opportunity and you're interested in this space and understanding the direction that's being taken, I think that report is very eye-opening in that it really illuminates the areas that the FATF has encouraged the UAE to really focus on. And I think what we've seen is that has been the case. And it's been so encouraging to witness the proliferation of activity being issued by the central banks, not only in UAE, but throughout the GCC, to really strengthen these controls. And as a business, we have absolutely had to sort of accommodate the issuance of these new directives. As a compliance professional, personally, it's fantastic because what it does is give us more power and authority within the companies to enact the kind of controls that really should be implemented in order to run an ethical company. And let's not forget, the ultimate goal here is to ensure that clean money from legal, clean business should not end up in the hands of bad actors, corrupt actors, or terrorist actors. And so those of us in clean industries have a special sort of duty to ensure that the business that results from the actions of our operations ends up circulating only to other actors who appreciate those values. And so when we've seen that these regulations have come out, it's really been a welcome respite to add more authority to and leverage to our position, so that we can ask internal stakeholders and require internal stakeholders to come in line with these regulations. So that's really been a motivating force, and we've used that FATF report to kind of illuminate the importance of implementing UBO requirements, as well as strengthening AML and CTF requirements.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tomel. Mohammed, over to you, please, if you don't mind.
Thank you, Tomel, for the introduction and giving background to the FATF mutual evaluation of the country. Yes, definitely. Safety, as you know, it's in the limelight across the globe, not only the UAE or in the region. It's in the limelight across the globe because of the understanding of the countries has been increased to great extent of the repercussions or the results of not having a proper compliance framework in the country, because it has a direct impact on the country's economy as well as the financial systems. It is definitely a threat to the stability of any country, especially a country like UAE, because it's one of the most open and sophisticated economy in the region as well as the world. And as you are all aware, UAE is one of the business hub for the trade, and it is continuing to do so. And it's strategically important for UAE because it's being a business hub. It also brings enormous risk from AML CFT perspective, right? So UAE's AML CFT landscape has got a lot of advancement, especially past 4 years. You can say post 2018 implementation of the national AML CFT law, and parallelly the FATF's mutual evaluation of the country, as Tomel has mentioned, while it is applauding the efforts carried out by the UAE from AML CFT perspective, there are a lot of areas which they have recommended to be improved, right? And a lot of room for improvement as suggested in the mutual evaluation report. And UAE's commitment, it's not purely based on the fact of the thing. It has, because it's wise leadership towards a sustainable economy. It's part of the strategic idea to have better controls, not allowing the illegal funds to flow through the UAE's economy. So that it's got a strategic element as well for the UAE, considering it being an international hub for trade and economy. So what should I say? What I wanted to say about the mutual evaluation and its aftermath? It's definitely has resulted in a lot of initiatives based on the areas which has been identified for improvement. So you can say there were several guidelines or regulatory actions being carried out by AML supervisors across FI and DNFPP sector, which is basically Central Bank of the UAE and the Ministry of Economy for the DNFPP sector. So it's definitely interesting to see the mutual evaluation and its outcome. And what we can say is UAE is on the right track, and it has got the real attitude towards making this country a global standard across the region, in the region as well as across the world, from AML CFT perspective. And the initiatives led by the National Committee for AML CFT, which is actually bearing the fruits already, as you can see. The only thing is, the challenging part is that, see, as a layman, as Tomal has mentioned or Sachit has introduced in the beginning, it can be overwhelming for the industry, that a lot of activities. I mean, basically, you'll be, as a layman, you'll be wondering what's happening in the background. Every week or every month, there are new guidelines issued by the regulators. A lot of requirements coming up with tight deadlines. But what's happening behind it is a lot of things happening behind the scene, which is definitely to ensure that UAE is in the forefront of the AML safety scenario in the region, as well as from the global perspective. So yes, so I would like to explain more about in the coming in the remaining parts of the session about the background of the national risk assessment and all those things. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mohammed. One of the questions that we've had from the attendees most recently, it says from George Gowie, what is the time frame to implement these AML directives on financial and non-financial entities? Myself, I know the answer to this, but if you'd like, probably Mohammed, to shed some light on this, is there a particular time frame for them to basically implement these AML requirements on them?
So as and when the entity is identified as an DNFPP, I'm specifically talking about DNFPP because FI is more matured area from AML CFT supervision perspective, but DNFPPs, it's an evolving area. It's something new as far as they are concerned. As and when a DNFPP is identified to be a DNFPP, which is to be licensed or regulated by Ministry of Economy, their responsibility starts immediately. There is no time frame because we cannot park the risk side, and we cannot say that, okay, we've just established and we've got 6 months or 1 year term now to start, because the risk start anytime. The risk is not, we cannot hide the risk, right? So it's understanding the risk that is very important. As in, when you start an entity, or if you're already running entity, it's understanding the risk. That's lying at the top of everything. What is the AML safety risk posed to my entity? Is there any possibilities that my customers or the way I do business can have an impact on the economies of UAE from an AML safety perspective? So this is something we cannot say that you have to wait for another 1 year to complete, and there is nothing like that. I mean, there is no such time frame to implement. This is as and when you understand the risk.
Yes. Thank you very much, Mohammed. And thank you to Tomal as well for your input. We'll move on to the second question. What beneficial ownership means, why identifying UBOs is important, and how it ties up with compliance checks, sanction screening, PEP identification, and adverse media searches. Sachit, please, if you don't mind answering that.
Absolutely, not a problem. So I think just to touch on, and it sort of leads to this question as well, but to touch on the previous one as well, at a federal level, there's a lot of changes happening. There's a new AML executive office that was set up earlier this year. There's a new private-public partnership that's been set up over the last few months that lots of people are consulting on, and there is a lot of input around the new legislation that's coming out, etc. But having said that, of course, all of the legislations give when when it starts due by, and it's always in a month or in a week or whatever it is. It's not, you don't get years to start to comply. And it is actually really sort of quick changes, especially around sort of some of the UBO things that came about. I believe, I can't remember the exact sort of time frame given, but I think it was about 20 or 25 days at the time. It was based on a cabinet resolution, which was Resolution 58, that was issued in August this year. It was itself an update to a resolution that was issued in the previous year that set out what UBOs mean when we say UBOs, and what reporting needs to happen. Now, I won't go into sort of all of the legislation in detail, but the legislation is quite clear what they consider a UBO. Now, it's anyone who's got over 25% ownership in a company. It's people who have more than 25% influence around directors, managers, etc. And there's sort of a very set criteria as to what qualifies as a UBO. And I think that's one of the great things given in the legislation itself. It doesn't leave too much for judgment and therefore errors, essentially. So if you go through that, it's very clear what the UAE considers a UBO, and therefore what do you need to report. What do you need to report as your UBO register, what do you need to report as your director's register, and what do you need to report as your manager's register. It's very clear, and I think that's helpful for companies, especially when they're starting from sort of a lower maturity level, because that guidance is quite helpful. Now, how does that actually help some of the other financial institutions, etc.? The key issue that financial institutions continue to have, and it's been over the last 20 years or so, or 30 years maybe, when AML has come to the forefront, has always been related to data. It's the lack of data that generates lots of alerts, whether it's transaction monitoring alerts or name screening alerts, that then becomes a huge burden. Compliance cost for banks and therefore the economy in general is immensely high. And if you look at some of these alerts, actually their systems are running at, say, 80, 90, and some of them even 95% in certain scenarios, false positive rates. And if you take any other system and say it is correct 80% of the time, we'd say, well, actually that system's not working. But the banks have no choice just because of the lack of data. And UBOs, etc., would really help banks in their screening systems and really cut down on that data. They'll help identify related party transactions better. They'll help actually onboard and risk assess customers better. So you know, actually, okay, this customer wants to be a new customer with us. Actually, who owns it? Is it a PEP? Is it not a PEP? Who actually owns it? What's the history behind that person? Are there related parties? All of that lead to better outcomes for banks, cost savings for banks. And this is really sort of talking from a bank perspective. But that's part of that the solution. Of course, it helps the regulatory and the supervisory areas as well from a government perspective. And we'll come to the challenges, I think, in a little bit. But one of the big challenges in UAE is that there's 50 plus jurisdictions, in a sense, with all of the free zones. So this helps normalize some of that and really sort of help with the screening, even at a governmental level, to really identify who's actually owns what, who's the ultimate beneficial owner on these things. I think that's one of the key things that comes out of this legislation. And that's really the way I see the UBO legislation is a complementary legislation to what the AML legislation is. You have that almost as an enabler to achieve the objectives in the grander AML legislation. John.
Thank you, Saeed. Tomel, would you like to shed some light on this for us?
Sure. So, the question is quite broad, and I think, as Sachit pointed out and really illuminated in wonderful detail, is that financial institutions really have been dealing with these matters and have a regulatory burden that sort of far exceeds other industries, right? I come from oil and gas, I come from engineering, automotive, and now we're in the tech sector. So this issue really diverges, or rather, can be segregated into financial services, which have, had long history of dealing with these issues. And I think, the fact that the UAE has come on board and announced these regulatory requirements further strengthen that. And I think for non-financial institutions, this is a welcome respite and a welcome advancement, because anyone who's worked in the region, and it's not just the UAE, the Middle East, CIS, East Asia, significant portions of the African continent, finding out the ultimate beneficial owner of the third parties you are working with is a significant challenge. And centralized registries, requirements to report UBO information, this kind of regulatory frameworks within these regions is really sporadic and inconsistent, I would say. And so as a compliance professional being tasked with ensuring you are, from a sort of ethical standpoint, doing the right thing and ensuring that money is flowing in the right directions. And then from a regulatory standpoint now, ensuring that you are properly diverting funds away from these bad actors is now really a clear mandate for non-financial industries. So I think it's an incredibly valuable point. And to what I was speaking about earlier, especially given the fact that the UAE is really an international hub, and there are many multinational organizations that exist here for non-financial industries. There are also anti-bribery laws, such as the UK Bribery Act, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which require us and have required us to ensure that the third parties that we work with are good actors, right? And so it's interesting. I was just talking about this with my team earlier today. The importance and the why of why is it important? You know, what is the context of UBO? Yes, it's critical that we understand who owns it, but it's ultimately about the money, right? Where is the money actually ending up? And that's the point of the whole UBO structure, and ensuring that you have that information on hand. Once we understand where the money is flowing, and we can make an informed decision about whether we feel comfortable doing business with that. The whole reason why corruption and why illicit business continues to grow is because these bad actors are able to successfully launder their money from illegal activities and essentially clean their money through clean businesses. So, you know, people such as us, people in the compliance profession, we are in many ways and in many senses the only, or rather the first, or one of the first enforcement sort of bodies able to stop this from happening, right? So that when legal enterprises, such as your organization, is interacting or giving business to third parties, you have the opportunity, through understanding who the UBO is, to ensure that that sort of washing of illicit funds does not happen. And so this, this act of really ensuring that your compliance programs emphasize UBO is not only a regulatory sort of requirement, it really is the right thing to do. It's what we should be doing as compliance professionals morally to help promote a more ethical world, really, and a more moral sort of business environment.
Couldn't agree anymore, Tom. Definitely so, and especially on the financial institution side, because obviously the money, when it comes through the financial institutions, is the first step of what's known the placement, and this is where the money will start to funnel in from the proceeds of the crimes and so on. Thank you very much for both of you. I'll just highlight a couple of questions we have from the audience. Somebody asked a question, and that probably can go to Mohammed. Will the UBO information in the UAE be made available for third parties? It means to the public. From Wasim Antar, please.
Thank you for the question. Good question. Unfortunately, not all the details or information is being made to the public in line with the international best practices of the regulatory requirements from the international bodies. But there is something called a National Economic Register, which is part of the MOE's website, where you can see the basic information of any legal entity based in the UAE. But there is also at the back end full information about the ultimate beneficial owners, which is available to the UAE authorities.
Thank you, Mohammed. There was another question, somebody saying, Fawad Ahmed, seeking guidance for UAE-based companies does not hold TIN number and global intermediary identification number for reporting purposes, FATCA and CRS certification. I can probably just answer that very quickly. Perhaps something like the LEI, the legal entity identifier, can help with the absence of TIN numbers or other unique identifiers in the UAE. Thank you very much to both of you so far. So we'll move on to other questions, and if we can accelerate a little bit the time and answering questions, so we'll have plenty of time to address all the topics that we would like to address. So on the regulation side, what are the new developments in the AML supervisory area across various sectors in the UAE, and what is expected from a regulated entity? And can we expect more stringent policies or regulatory requirements in the near future? Again, Mohammed, over to you.
Thank you. So UAE's AML safety landscape, which is basically starting from the AML law of 2018. It's law number 20 of 2018, and the cabinet decision followed by that. It is cabinet decision 10 of 2019, which is the implementing regulation of the law. These are the pillars of the UAE's AML safety regulatory framework. And there were additional cabinet resolution or decisions followed by that, like the one which I've mentioned by Sajid earlier regarding the ultimate beneficial owners, which is cabinet decision number 58 of 2020. And followed by that, we have cabinet decision number 74 of 2020 related to the terrorism list regulation and implementation of UN Security Council. Then we have Cabinet Resolution 53 of 2021 regarding the administrative penalties related to AML safety violations or breaches. So we can say law number 20 of 2018 and the cabinet decision followed by that. These are the key to look at. This is where all the obligations for the FIs as well as the DNFPs are mentioned, and obviously the authorities are keep on issuing guidelines which are not binding, but obviously these are as part of the outreach activities. There are guidelines issued on each and every topic, typologies and all. So beneficial owner procedures, which is basically which stipulates that each and every entity has to keep UBO information at their end, and they have to submit it to their respective registrars as well. This is the key element of the decision number 58 of 2020. Wherein they have to identify beneficial owners up to 25% and above, and as well as the nominee directors, as well as if there are no UBOs identified, they have to keep the information of the entity senior management as a UBO. This is the key as far as decision number 58 is concerned. With regard to 74 of 2020 regarding terrorist list and implementation of UN Security Council. This is applicable to both FIs and DNFPPs, wherein an authority called Committee for Goods and Materials Subject to Import and Export Control in UAE, which is issuing, which is managing the list associated with the UN Security Council list, as well as UAE list of designated individuals and entities, which is updated from time to time. And this decision stipulates that the entities should have a proper mechanism in place to screen their customers as well as beneficial owners and connected parties while onboarding as well as an ongoing basis, and to identify any matches, maybe potential matches or actual matches against those designated names against the UN Security Council or UAE local list. And there are requirements to report it to the regulatory authorities as well as through the financial intelligence unit through the appropriate channels such as GoAML. So all other requirements with regard to the AML CFT framework is coming from the cabinet decision number 10 of 2019, wherein I can just have the highlight of this cabinet decision, wherein the entity should have risk assessment as part of the compliance framework. That the primary element, that the most important element is the risk assessment. Risk assessment can be both business-wide and risk assessment as well as customer risk assessment. The entity should assess their risk from AML perspective if they are posed to any AML safety risk from their customer base, the products and services, the channels, and the geography where they are operating from. And based on the understanding of the risk, they should have enough controls in place to mitigate those risks. This is the key element of this decision. As part of this compliance framework, they should have a proper due diligence measures in accordance with the risks they have identified. Obviously, the word risk-based is very, very important here, because especially when we are talking about the smaller entities and larger entities, like in the NFP sector, you can have multinational entities operating in multiple jurisdictions. At the same time, you can have a single store shop which is acting as an NFP. So the risk posed to these entities are unique, and you cannot have similar risk mitigating controls at both entities, because the risk posed to them is entirely different. It's unique. So it is very important to understand the risk posed to it and accordingly tailor the mitigating controls. Mitigating controls is primarily involving the customer due diligence measures while onboarding their clients as well as on an ongoing basis. Then the customer screening measures against sanction list, adverse media, in line with the risk identified by the entity. Appointment of a compliance officer, which is a very important element as per the cabinet decision and the law, which will help the entity to mitigate the risk to great extent, because we need expertise to do these activities. These are specialized areas which requires expertise. So a competent compliance officer is part of the compliance program. Yeah. And obviously policy and procedures, and there should be procedures, controls around customer screening, customer transaction monitoring, suspicious activity reporting, and other activities like there are specific reporting requirements. For example, for the dealers in precious metals, there is something called PMSR, wherein they have to report transactions above a particular threshold. So there are record keeping requirements for each and every entity which is falling under the DNFP and FI sector. There should be an independent audit of the function, the AML safety framework itself, on a regular basis. So the framework, and it should be supported by the senior management of the. There should be top approach so that this is. It has the right support from the board of directors or the senior management or the owners of the entity. So that it's a culture. Building a robust compliance culture with the right elements, starting from the risk assessment, due diligence, compliance officer. This is the key. So and obviously it can be risk based, and the law and regulations of the cabinet decision is allowing entities to have to be on a risk based approach. That means a smaller entity it may be like overwhelming for them to see that, okay, how such a small entity can have all these sophisticated things, but it's purely based on the risk which is identified by you as an entity, which is posed to you from the AML safety perspective. So a bigger entity or bigger institution, a global institution can have much sophisticated framework, including screening and other measures. But at the same time, the cabinet decision gives the provision to have a simpler framework for entities which is identified themselves as low risk. So these are the key from the regulatory perspective. There are a lot of guidelines issued by both Central Bank of UAE and Ministry of Economy to supplement this cabinet decision, the AML, which as part of the outreach activities, which will help the entities to implement these regulations. Yes, thank you.
Absolutely, thank you very much, Mohammed. Next question is, there's been increased focus of the UAE authorities with regards to UBO over the last 2 years, such as the Cabinet Resolution number 58 that you mentioned earlier, Mohammed, of 2020. How do you currently deal with these specific regulations in your organization? And have you had to implement new processes, Alina?
Yeah, thank you very much for this opportunity to talk. First of all, indeed, in the UAE, the focus of authorities on the UBO disclosure requirements was increasing over the past 2 years, and the main trigger behind it was the mentioned earlier FATF evaluation report on the UAE. Notably, at the time of its publication, there we already faced quite stringent AML safety regulation, but the UBO regulation was not existent at the time, and that's what the report pointed out also, as well as highlighting the specifics of this very complicated market, because as we know, UAE is a fragmented system of registries. There are currently 39 of them, and it gives rise to a very different understanding and implementation application of preventive measures. So it creates regulatory arbitrage where the companies, let's say individuals, they try to use different jurisdictions within the country with less stringent requirements to basically disguise the real beneficial ownership. Also, FATF pointed out on the lack or absence of sanctions, efficient, proportionate sanctions that would create the dissuasive environment in order to prevent such type of negative business practices. Well, and in response to this critics, UAE came up with the Cabinet Resolution on Decision 58 of 2020. It came into force in the end of August 2020. And basically imposed an obligation on all the legal persons in this country to create the registries of beneficial owners, shareholders, partners, and where applicable, also nominee directors and managers, and submit them to the relevant authorities, which are the registering authorities. And we were allowed initially 60 days by 27 October of previous year to do it, but in practice, legal and compliance experts like myself faced a little bit of a confusion because not all free zones came up timely with the clear guidance as to the format of these registers and the submission channels. So the practicalities behind, as per my experience, is that I ended up with a double submission. First of all, I sent out by email to DWC and DAFSA, free zones where companies of our group are incorporated in the UAE. These registers in the free formats that basically only followed the criteria set in the decision. And then both free zones came up with dedicated online portals through which I resubmitted the same details. Notably, authorities reserve the right to request for additional information or supporting documents if they need some kind of clarification. In my case, it did not happen, so it was left at that point. And later in 2021, we all faced the, let's say, supporting cabinet decision number 53, which introduced administrative penalties against the violation of a beneficial owner procedure. And there was another timeline, or let's say a reminder of the timeline to submit the registries to the authorities. It was 30th of June, but now under the threat of clear sanctions or penalties that could total up to 100,000 dirhams, and also suspension of the business license from 1 to 12 months. Apologies for this. Sorry, I'm back. Yeah, timeline was then extended to 7th of July. And basically the role of legal and compliance officer professional in-house also covers updating of these registries and timely submitting these changes to authorities within the following 15 days. That's the practicalities behind. To save time, I can briefly touch base on the challenges. So probably initial technical capabilities of the free zones was the challenge, as I mentioned. It felt like not all of the free zones were ready technically to accept all this flow of information, to store and process it duly, but now everything is clear and the submission process is very straightforward. There is nothing complicated about it, really. Maybe some companies would face a challenge of disclosure in principle, because some of the owners of the business, they would be kind of reluctant to disclose all the details, and that's the role of compliance professional, basically to raise awareness of the regulation of potential negative repercussions in terms of in case of circumventions. circumvention of these regulations. And I would basically support points raised by Tomel that we are discussing a very specific topic today, but compliance has to be addressed with a very holistic approach. It's not only the regulations of the UAE. You cannot kind of segregate it in your day-to-day job from the global laws and regulations, FCPA and the UK Anti-Bribery Act, and so forth. So it's always everyday, day-to-day effort, and it shall be underpinned by deep understanding of ethical side of it, and most importantly, you have to be very, let's say, approachable to the members of your team, and you have to be in frequent interactions with the management to get their buy-in for enforcement of robust compliance program, and kind of to be inspirational, so that not only you yourself, but the management also project that right tone at the top.
Thank you, Alina. Moving on, and this question will be to Sachit. Have you witnessed an increased flow of requests from your clients in the region with regards to UBO discovery and identification following the new regulation? And what differences have you witnessed across the GCC countries? And if we can keep it brief, Sachit, please, because we're going to be running out of time otherwise. Thank you.
There's certainly an increase, and I think the increase is not just around the UBO sector, but across sort of all the work that happens around the AML framework, right? So I think increase, that the way I see it, is just one element of the increased work that's happening all around sort of the AML sector. You've got lots of clients that we are now supporting who are not financial institutions, who are not sophisticated or haven't already done too much around the AML space, who are looking around frameworks, setting up sort of a lot of these UBO requests, especially around suppliers and understanding how to get a lot of that information. And Anton, I'm sure you can speak a little bit more about specific UBO requests coming in, and I'm sure you're seeing a lot more volume from your side, because even we would, you go to yourselves, if you are the providers on supporting some of and getting some of these databases through, and I think you can add on to that as well, then you would be seeing a lot more volume as well. But we are seeing the increase in volume, and also the quality and the extent that people go into all the way across, and that's sort of my view on that very quickly.
Thank you very much. Moving on to the subject of challenges, what has been the UAE authorities' support to private organization to ensure adherence to the AML regulatory obligations across regulated and non-regulated industry? Mohammed, to you, but very, very briefly, please, if you don't mind.
Yeah, thank you. So from the public-private partnership perspective, there are a lot of things happening in the UAE. There is a public-private partnership committee which has been created under the National AML Safety Committee, which Sachit has mentioned earlier. It was created in UAE earlier. So the
offices right now.
The objective is to effectively communicate to the private sector, and share intelligence and enhance collaboration among each other to increase the understanding, because it's as authority, it's not only the objective of us to implement regulations, but also to engage with the industry, so that they very well understand what are the requirements. So PPP is one of the key initiative which is taken by the UAE. Currently, there are 15 plus government agencies and 20 plus private sector entities which are part of the FI and DNFBB sector, which is working towards for a better understanding of the AML CF requirements across the region in the country. This is in line with the international best practice like US, UK, and Singapore, and a similar legislative platform is being built here. Yeah,
I agree. Thank you very much, Mohammed. Next question is, what challenges have you faced to properly implement the new UBO regulations? That question to Alina.
Okay, I'll a little bit touch upon that subject, but let me approach it very briefly. It concerns the specifics of the industries, business aviation, and you would logically imagine that some of our clients are high net worth or ultra high net worth individuals who would be super sensitive to some kind of disclosure requests. And that's the main challenge that concerns the beneficial ownership, not as applied to JEREX itself, but as applied to our basic comprehensive understanding of the beneficial ownership as part, let's say, of the due diligence process against all of our customers, as well as suppliers, as well as our business partners. Since recommendations of FATF were made mandatory for all the, let's say, financial, non-financial sectors in the UAE, I'm using it as a strong point, and I'm using it basically to explain to other departments in my company, especially the sales department, who are quite careful with all the clients and potential clients, that basically the current global regulatory framework give us no room for any kind of exceptions and for any kind of negotiations when it comes to these disclosure requirements. So, and the fact alone that UAE is, let's say, catching up and producing all these very necessary regulations also very in the favor of in-house compliance professional to be able to again accentuate that this is a very black and white regulations from which we cannot deviate. And again, it's a day-to-day work, and it's an effort and commitment. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Alina. On the subject of burden, as you just mentioned, on the in-house adherence to the regulations and so on, we will move to the subject of technology. Me being very, big fan of technology, how can new technologies support and simplify the AML screening and UBO lookup processes? And what is, or has your organization's strategy been? Tomel, over to you.
Sure. So I think the good news is that there's been a proliferation of cutting edge and new age technologies, a lot of startups in this space to help support the due diligence process. I mean, there are at least 10 that have come out this year to help compliance professionals streamline, organize, and stay on top of the increasing issuance of these new regulatory regimes across multiple jurisdictions. So I would encourage, of course, anyone looking to master the subject to take advantage of those. It's amazing the kind of progress that has been made in this space. Due diligence used to be done on pieces of paper and used to be very cumbersome, and now it's all streamlined with the advantage of pulling instantaneous information from a multitude of databases across the globe. We in particular leverage not only these technological sort of platforms to help us do our third-party due diligence, but we make the use of organizations, due diligence service providers, and especially in this region where UBO information continues to be a challenge. And our program, of course, emphasizes the importance of that. We have to leverage sometimes, or oftentimes rather, third-party service providers, such as Cedar Rose, to get that information for us. Because it's so critical and important in the decision making and determining whether the company can proceed in doing business with these third parties. And because of the complexities, even oftentimes with these platforms, which go a far way, but oftentimes fall short. So that's really been important, is obtaining these service providers who can even go sometimes on the ground and obtain this information directly from government organizations if required.
Thank you, Thomas. And how important is data access and coverage to uncover and verify UBO risks? Sachit?
Absolutely. I think access to data is the critical element for everyone. If we talk about screening, it is screening against data against set patterns or data against set lists. That's absolutely critical. And like Thomas mentioned, that's exactly what some of these companies, especially people like Terrorism, are doing. Is giving you access to that data in a digital way that allows you to do the screening quickly and well. It can be automated, non-automated, but it just allows that access, that digital access, all the way through. Now, obviously, as more and more automated things get, it just makes life easier for compliance professionals, but absolutely critical from my perspective.
Thank you very much. Last words and question to all our guest speakers. What best practice can you recommend the audience to implement as internal policy processes? I'll start with Tomer because I know you've got a rush straight after the webinar.
Sure. So I think it would be twofold. For the first is, criminals are infinitely creative, and they're always inventing ways to circumvent the process, which is why regulators have such a tough time constantly issuing new decrees to stay on top of them. So the first would be to ensure that the process is iterative. Conducting a diligence one time and sort of stacking it on the shelf and never revisiting it is probably not a good way to approach this. It's very easy to open shell companies. It's very easy to change shareholdings of a company from one day to the next. So ensuring that you have an iterative process, I think, is important. And the second point is ensuring the layers and depth of due diligence. So it's not important. It's important to not just do due diligence on the third party that you are directly contracting with or the customer that's directly engaging you, but the subcontractors of that third party. So oftentimes what we've seen, and this is another way where criminals circumvent the system, is where the third party will engage with you, but then subcontract its works to another laundering entity. So it's incumbent upon us to ensure that the diligence continues down, to the subcontractors or to any of the legal entities that are being tasked and engaged with. And of course, the question is always, well, when do you stop? Because if the subcontractor then subcontracts, which we have seen that, then you have to put in legal frameworks for that, right? You have to put in legal limits to say, okay, we only agree to 1 or 2 levels, and so on and so forth.
Absolutely. So good policy and technology at your fingerprint gives you that information going down to subcontractors as well as above clients and clients and so on. Very good. Thank you very much, Tomer, for joining us today. I will pass the question next to Alina, please.
Yeah, I actually have an interesting point to add here because recently, in cooperation with Cedar Rose, we created one beautiful thing which I would call an internal control. So we managed to come up with a solution how to embed Cedar Rose product with our internal ERP. And without going too deep into details and breaking any kind of confidentiality issues, I would say that this was very important for us, considering, first of all, as I mentioned, the specifics of the industry and also our global operations and the plethora of regulations that we have to comply with. It's not only AML, definitely you will understand that it's also sanctions compliance, and for us to receive timely information about the politically exposed person and any kind of adverse media. For us it's important, and no compliance department, however big it would be, could basically control, monitor, supervise this process. So by embedding this internal control inside our system, we ensure that no client will be even able to receive our quotation, or no supplier will be able to come up with the proposal unless they first of all submit to us a basic due diligence set of documents, and they will be automatically screened. And in case of any red flags, we will just cut them off from our business. So that's the beauty of technologies to me.
Thank you very much. As we're running out of time, I'm just going to answer one question from the audience. Could we provide more clarification by existing examples of AML, especially the most famous methods? I'll just throw some lines. Maybe Tomer can add more. One of the very few that are known for money laundering strategies or businesses is art and antiquities dealings through sales and auctions. Real estate and property is another one. Precious metals and stones and jewelry is also another one. Casinos, online gambling is also another very famous method of funneling money through the systems. Tomer, do you want to add any more to these, the bunch of these kind of activities that criminals normally funnel their money through money laundering? Or if not, we can move on to another subject very quickly.
Yeah, I think that was pretty I mean, you name it and they do it.
Exactly.
The list is unending.
This is why it's very important, as we tackled in the very beginning, regulation starts from the very beginning of an entity's operations. Set up a good policy in place before you start operation, implement that policy from day one, and keep that policy progressing and developing and changes with the changes of the market, technologies, because criminals are always on the lookout for ways and means of conducting their operations. So I want to say some great insights here. Thank you so much for our panel today. I would like to thank you, each and every one of you, and the attendees, of course, for joining this webinar on anti-money laundering, AML, and ultimate beneficiary owners, UBO. Before we close our discussion, I would like to remind all attendees that you are entitled to 3 complimentary CR Comply checks of your company or for your company. CR Comply is an automated all-in-one compliance screening tool to assess third-party risks level and accelerate the customer onboarding process and monitoring, uncover sanctioned entities, PEPs, PEP, and adverse media on companies and on people. Thank you very much, every one of you, for contributing to this webinar, and look forward to seeing you in person in Dubai soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye for now.
Very much. Thanks, everyone.